Welcome, Austin and Jim. I thought we'd spend the time talking about the Ukraine. A lot going on there. There's a lot of different things we can talk about. But I saw a poll, Jim, that the opinions of the Ukrainians themselves have reached a point where now there's 50% of them thinking that they need a negotiated settlement. And that's a huge change for them, that they've got a majority of people that want the war to end. And so I think war fatigue has caught up with them. What what's your feelings about this?
Well, Putin wants to end the war as well because Russia is taking the worst of it. The sanctions have done a lot of damage. They burned through their $200 billion National Reserve Fund, and the economy is in a shambles. Uh, Zelensky recently presented a 10-part plan, as it were, that includes letting Ukraine get into NATO, which Russia does not want. In other words, Putin is willing to concede the territories that Russia occupies, not concede that Russia owns them, but concede that Russia is occupying them. The overall sentiment in Ukraine, NATO, is to allow Ukraine into NATO when the war ends, if the war ends, as they put it. They can end the war right now, which apparently Putin wants. The Ukrainians can agree to it, and if they go into NATO, which Putin really can't stop, except by starting the war again, which he can't afford to do. I mean, he's running into problems at home. People are questioning his leadership and basically complaining about all of the economic ruin and other problems. I mean, Russia has lost over 700,000 men, dead and disabled. That was a secret, as it were, that somebody spilled, some Russian, a woman who misspoke, as it were, and let the cat out of the bag. But that is not surprising to those who have been following the war. Our numbers have always been 600 and some odd thousand. It's probably 700,000 now, and the Russians have confirmed it. They cannot afford to take any more losses. They've got North Koreans in Kursk province, getting ready to try and toss the Ukrainians out. The Ukrainians are willing to negotiate, and they might be able to get a deal out of Russia because Russia needs a deal right now. So right now, it's in the favor of the Russians. By the way, something people tend to look, when Russia invaded, Russia occupied 26% of Ukraine. Now, because Ukraine has been successful in its operations in the last year, I guess, 6 months, they now only occupy 18% of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are willing to keep on going, but hey, they'll stop if Russia will try not to stop them going into NATO. And actually, his 10-point plan was getting guarantees from the Russians. Guarantees from the Russians aren't worth much, but they occupy the nuclear Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in Russia, and they have to somehow make sure that doesn't blow up because it would affect Russia as much as Ukraine. They want to have a guarantee on Ukraine getting its grain out, which they've been doing, but they've had to fight. They've had to destroy most of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in order to do it. They want to put restrictions on Russian oil sales and other energy, any energy sources. They want to help from Russia in restoring their power infrastructure, which the Russians are still bombing as we speak, or at least as of yesterday. Release all prisoners, including the children that were deported to Ukraine. 3 years ago. Of course, they want their lost terrain returned, as it were, or at least for the Russians to recognize it's negotiable. Like Putin is saying, what's mine is mine, and what yours is negotiable. Well, the Ukrainians are willing to negotiate, withdraw all troops, and stop fighting, and restore Ukraine. I'm reading off their 10-point Zelensky's 10-point list. Restoration of Ukraine's borders with Russia. The Russians will probably stall on that because they want to keep what they've stolen. We stole it fair and square, and it's ours, as the saying goes. Special tribunal for Russian war crimes, prevention of ecocide, which means protecting the environment, and that means helping with demining and restoring water treatment facilities which were blown up. They blew that huge dam in Ukraine and flooded large areas and basically destroyed a lot of agriculture in that part of Ukraine, and basically creating a security architecture, which the Russians said they did in 1994, and we know how that went, and confirmation in a document that the war is over. The Russians are kind of inclined to agree to that simply to get them away from the sanctions. So, there it is, and I don't know how much they're going to get out of it because the Russians are not willing to give up everything. Really, they don't want to give up anything, but at this point, they don't have any choice. They cannot stop NATO from going into Ukraine, into NATO, and NATO has said that will happen when the war ends. Well, if Russia's going to declare the war ending, then bingo, NATO's in Ukraine, and any further aggression on Russia's part brings them up against the entire NATO alliance, which includes the United States. Of course, we guaranteed in '94, along with the British, the sanctity, as it were, Ukrainian borders, all Ukrainian borders, the original ones, including Crimea and the Donbass provinces. And of course, that's going to be a hard pill for the Russians to swallow, even, if they don't if they don't actually plan on following through with giving up that territory. So there it is. The Ukrainians have won. They've gained a lot of territory back. If fighting stops, they have to stop their offensives. They're still fighting. I don't know what that means about Kursk province. Russia didn't mention that in any of their communiques. But with the Ukrainian NATO, Russia is basically up against a brick wall. And so Ukraine has won. They're the victors.
Yeah, I know there is a lot of stuff coming out about how the Russian economy just continues to collapse.
Along with the railroads, that damn ball bearing problem.
Right. Austin, what are your views on some of the things that are happening here?
Well, Jim has touched on several of them. I just point out there, good gosh, well, strategy page has covered so much about Ukraine, even before 2014. A couple of things in 2004, dealing with the beginning of Ukraine throwing off Russian, really political infiltration and intimidation. And I look back, there's a column of mine written in November of 2004, which talked about Putin's desire to rebuild the Russian Empire. And the roots of that actually comes out of the post-Cold War, or second edition of Quick and Dirty Guide to War, where Jim and I in the Russian section, understand that came out actually before the Soviet Union was officially dissolved at the end of '91, was that somebody was going to come back sometime in Russia and pick up the sword again and try to reestablish Russian hegemony over its, they started calling it the near abroad. And meaning, in that case, many of the SSRs that the Soviet Union, that Moscow lost when the Soviet Union fell apart. But there were four pieces to turn it into a superpower. And some of this comes out of some fine work in the late 19th and early 20th century by a fellow by the name of Mackinder. Those pieces are Russia, with all of Siberia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And I made a little joke out of it. The joke comes out of, I think, about 1999 in a speech I was giving, question and answer afterwards. And I said, you call it the Rubik, like Rubik's Cube. It's a puzzle and you put it back together. And Putin all but said, he starts saying it definitely, 99, 2000 elements of it. By 2004 and 2005, he's talking about reconstructing, rebuilding the Russian Empire. And he's going to do it by hook or by crook, by invasion. First, he tries it by subterfuge and sabotage, but he's going to do it by invasion. And experimented with it in 2008, going into Georgia, so-called hybrid war. It really wasn't all that new. Many of the techniques that he was using, Serbia had used in 1990, 91, and its attacks on Croatia. and Bosnia, and they were based on the way the Turks, Greeks, and Bulgars and Serbs were attacking each other, voiding all-out war in the last decade of the 19th century and the first 12 years of the 20th century. And look how those played out. Part of the reason the ignition of World War I. He was using those techniques with some success, but with not any kind of absolute success. The U.S. reinforced Georgia by moving a brigade of Georgian troops out of Iraq back to Georgia, and suddenly the Russian hybrid war stopped. Now think about that. There was a movement. It was about 2,500 infantrymen that were part of the U.S. Led effort in Iraq, and suddenly airlift moves them out of Baghdad back to Tbilisi, and things start calming down after an not direct intervention, but pretty close to it by the U.S., by a NATO power. And then after that, we go to 2014 and the invasion of Crimea. Jim's already touched on that Budapest Accord of 1994. Why would, getting a little bit ahead here, Dan, but why would any Ukrainian, Zelensky, believe anything that Moscow says? Because they signed that accord. UK and US backed it. Bill Clinton promoted it as a nukes for peace example because Ukraine had, I think it was the third largest nuclear arsenal in 1994. And the deal was guarantee our territorial integrity, all of it, including Crimea, including the Donbass. And Russia signed it. And 2014, Putin's Russia just broke it. Took Crimea in, February, early March of 2014. And then try and remember this, I wrote about three
September?
columns about, no, it's March 18th, I think. March 9th.
Later he went after Donbass.
Right. But I'm going to say he formally annexed Crimea to Russia. And that was the first successful military territorial grab in Europe since World War II. The Serbs had failed, but Russia succeeded, and he was wildly lauded in Red Square. I mean, it was a big deal. And then, Jim, that's April, May starts hybrid war in the Donbass. It starts and lapses. They had a Minsk agreement that it was going to stop, and it didn't stop. And then let's just leap up to 2022, February 2022, perceiving real weakness in Washington. Washington, under the Biden administration, isn't going to respond. It's a window, and he thinks he's going to blitz it in 3 to 4 weeks, and he runs into a Ukraine that is now a nation in arms. Now, I know I've been on here for a few minutes, but look, Jim says Ukraine's won. Well, it's won by still existing. It's been heavily damaged, lost lots of people, infrastructure smashed, but it's still there. But there is at a strategic level, and Jim was touching on this, where Russia has lost. Russia has a desperately bad economy. It's been exposed as corrupt. That's one of the things that undermine their military, their corruption. It's been exposed as an oligarchy that doesn't reward a talent. What it does is reward your connection and your loyalty to the regime. And the other thing it's done, the attack on Ukraine, suddenly Sweden and Finland are NATO members. I mean, that is a huge strategic loss to Russia. And it's out there. Europe is still not paying its fair share in defense. And no, I'm not repeating Trump there. I'm repeating things that Americans were saying in the 1970s, 80s, a little bit in the 90s. But sorry, you're relying on the essentially United States and the United Kingdom to defend a wealthy Europe. That's begun to change remarkably at least in terms of GDP allocated by NATO members to defense. That's all a loss for Russia. But then I guess we're going to get into here as to how do you make peace out of this mess. So let's get to that.
Well, there's a window of opportunity which I'm hoping the Ukrainians will take. They can just go apply for NATO membership, and most NATO members, well, you need all of them to agree, are willing to allow Ukraine into NATO. If that happens, Russia is not going to attack, or if they do attack, they're going to attack, all the NATO member states, and that is a war they cannot win. Right now, they definitely cannot win it, but they're trying to regenerate their forces. That's going to take years. They expect to have it done by 2030. That may be a realistic target, but it may be too optimistic as well. The Russians are in very bad shape. They've not only lost the 700 and some odd thousand, troops, but they've lost millions of their basically educated citizens who have fled Russia to get away from being conscripted into the army and die in Ukraine, and just the corruption, as Austin points out, and they have gone west, and they're prospering in Europe, the United States, Canada, wherever they could find sanctuary, and plenty of places were glad to have, because these were well-educated, skilled Russians, and they had no trouble finding work. The Ukrainians did the same thing, but now in the last 6 months or so, Ukrainians who have gone into exile have been returning. In other words, they sense that Ukraine has stabilized, if not won, although going by the numbers, Ukraine has won. They occupy more of the formerly Russian occupied territory. They're about to get into NATO. The Russians are in no shape, and will not be in any shape to fight another war for years, 3 or 4 years, maybe longer. As Wilson pointed out, the Russians have to reconstitute their own economy, which is going to take a while, maybe a long while. Main thing Russia was to want to do by declaring peace is to get out from under the sanctions, and that will help them a lot. But again, like I said, it's a window of opportunity. If the Russians reconstitute before Ukraine gets into NATO, and agreements are made between NATO and Ukraine about reconstruction and defense and what have you, then the Russians will have another go at it. I think Austin also pointed out the Russians will keep attacking as long as they can, and you simply have to make it, how should I put it, impractical for Russia to go to war against NATO or Ukraine again. And that's something that has to be done within the next year or two, because the longer you wait, the more powerful the Russians are, going with their reconstitution activities. And when they are strong enough, again, as Austin pointed out, they'll go to war again. So there we are. I mean, Ukraine has won, but they could lose the victory. Victory is an elusive, idea. You can have it, and then you can just as quickly let it slip, between your fingers if you don't do something with it. I suspect the Ukrainians, with the losses from Russia fresh in their minds. I mean, as Wilson pointed out, their economy is a mess. Just recently, the Russians have started using IRBMs with conventional warheads to bombard Ukrainian energy targets. It's going to be a cold winter for a lot of Ukrainians because of these attacks. So they stopped just in time. NATO has pledged economic assistance to Ukraine, which they can certainly use. So, like I say, it's a window of opportunity. And if Ukraine and NATO don't take advantage of it, it's not going to do anybody any good, because the Russians will keep coming as long as they can with whatever they have. And as long as they are outnumbered, they're not going to be foolish enough to attack for a long time, for maybe a decade. I mean, it's a Russian thing. In 2014, when the Russians seized Crimea the first time around, the Ukraine had a lease, a deal with Russia to continue basing their Black Sea fleet in Sevastopol. And the Russians basically violated that. I mean, you can't trust the Russians. That's what it comes down to. I don't know how the Russians are going to regain any trust anytime soon. So it's a complicated situation, but it's pretty, plain that you can't trust the Russians, and the Ukrainians basically want, peace and reconstruction, and that's basically where it sits. Russians right now have no choice but to sue for peace, or to basically declare peace. They don't have to sue for anything. They can just say, okay, we're not fighting anymore. And it's already dying down. And the one reason they're doing it is because they're losing. There are negotiations now about the Ukrainians getting out of Kursk province, which that's the first time Russia has been invaded since 1941. And that makes a big impact on Russia. Yeah, they remember the Great Patriotic War, as they call it, World War II. Even now, after several generations have passed, the memory is still there, and it's still very much alive in Russia, if not in the rest of Europe or the United States. So you have to look at it like the Russians do, and the Russians are looking at a desperate situation, which they want to make the best of, and we have to make sure they don't to make too much of it, to encourage them so that it encourages them to go after us again.
So I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about some specifics about the war. The first is the TACMs that we sent, or have. Well, I guess we sent them, and they've been sitting there, and then we finally gave them permission to use them. Great name, ATACMS.
Army Tactical Missile.
Hey,
Right,
listen,
yeah.
that's really a fairly old system.
Yeah,
But it's a good one. I've seen it used in some war games. These weren't classified, even when the old missile defense using ATACMS forward place to suppress enemy IRBMs, and that's in the 1990s. Dan, it's a
yeah.
So they use them in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah, they've got a range of about 300 miles.
The
big thing, though, is that they're supersonic.
Yeah.
So it makes it very difficult for a system to shoot them down.
Well, they're not only quick and fast. If you're employing them, well, I won't go into all the details that the missile guys gave me on it, but they've got an ability to get through an enemy air defense, and so
right. And the Russians have countered by using a similar missile from their inventory that was quite impressive. We've got video of those things hitting, and they're obviously they probably rattled the Ukrainians pretty good. What really irritates me, Austin, is people keep referring to the Russians using ICBMs with what they used, and it's like, excuse me, Ukraine's on the same continent, and they don't need to do intercontinental ballistic missiles.
I think they're doing that to make a point. The point being that they could easily put a nuclear warhead in that missile,
right?
At IRBM. But
Dan, it's not just the Russians. There's some of the press reporting started calling them ICBMs, or threat of ICBMs and the like. So you can blame some of that on media ignorance, but
right.
No, yeah.
But are we in a missile war here for a while? Well, I know the Ukrainians have only used theirs once, but are we going to see a back and forth on this, Austin?
Look, we've already seen a type of missile war, long range. Drones are just slow. Some of the longer range drones, they're really no different than a very slow cruise missile. If you've got the guidance and locked in, they know where the target is. Now they're easier to pick up, both ground and overhead surveillance. But that's a long range strike is what it amounts to. So if you look at the Ukrainian use of long range drones, this has been going on, and look at them as deep strike, slow missiles. This has been going on. The thing is, let me answer your question with a kind of taking it in another direction. Is how do you deal with this evolving threat? And Germany, Europe, they're coming up with European Sky Shield is part of it. That's something actually the U.S. has been advocating for Europe to get involved in a mutual interconnected airspace defense system, modeled after Israeli Iron Dome. Jim and I have talked about Iron Dome ad infinitum on podcasts. And the thing is how, given the state of the war between Russia and Ukraine now, how do you get systems like that in with trained personnel, and also from the perspective of NATO, secure those systems so the Russians don't get a hold of them, figure out how to fake them out and take them. And that's pretty complicated. That's a tough thing to do. And one other comment on it too. Yeah, we're in it, and you've seen how rapidly you can deplete anti-missile missiles as well as anti-air missiles. But the crying need for Patriot PAC-3s, and we're having to up I'm talking about the U.S. now, up spur production of Patriot PAC-3s, and we discovered that our own defense infrastructure, manufacturing infrastructure, is weak and couldn't support us in a war. Maybe that's a valuable thing to discover out of this, but it also shows you how expensive stopping this kind of long range, medium range missile and drone threat is. It's extremely expensive. And yet, if you're going to protect infrastructure, like the nuclear plant at Zaporizhia, which is really within artillery range now, and artillery rockets, or production facilities in Western Ukraine, you're going to have to spend the money for those kind of defense systems.
So, Jim, let's talk drones. I know you like drones.
Everybody
One of the
likes
things is that AI is starting to be used in the Ukrainian drones more and more. And that's a scary proposition.
Well, it makes them more efficient. The Ukrainians basically invented drone warfare out of necessity during the war with Russia. And the Russians responded with their own drones, but the Ukrainians had a lead. And they are currently set to produce 4 million drones a year. They'll probably go ahead with that. You know, the Russians are out of weapons, and the Ukrainians are building more. The drone warfare comes in many different varieties, but the basic problem with drones is they are ever present. You can have drones in the air doing reconnaissance and surveillance 24 hours a day. And whenever they spot something, some of these surveillance drones have a warhead. And if they see something, boom, it goes. And they've been doing this in Ukraine. And that's something the Russians are well aware. The Russians are trying to build drones. They're trying to play catch up. But, you know, the Ukrainians have already built over 1 million of them. And they're planning on working with overseas manufacturers. I don't know who. I think it's one in Germany. I don't know if somebody in the United States is getting in on that, to produce 4 million drones a year. Now, if they do that, if they pile up millions of drones, you know, hidden in underground bunkers to give them some protection from Russian, you know, counter battery, they will basically force the Russians to run through basically a screen, as it were, a thick screen of drones to do any damage to Ukraine. The other thing that can go into Ukraine is aegis ashore. Now, I think we have one set up in Poland. That was a plan. I think that's actually been implemented. So the Poles feel fairly safe. The aegis ashore with the SP3, SM3 missile can take out satellites, and it has done so, you know, on a test basis. And it's very good at taking out any kind of incoming, you know, missile. So if there's anything that can stop Russian IRBMs or even ICBMs, it's the aegis ashore with this SM3, you know, anti-ballistic missile. So there are things that can be basically delivered to Ukraine to make them a bastion, as it were, air defense against any Russian attacks against Ukraine or, you know, Poland or, you know, the Eastern Europe. And the Europeans are all for that. They like the idea of Ukraine becoming part of the NATO alliance. And of course, now, you know, there's nothing to stop us from joining NATO. I don't think there are some countries like Hungary and what have you that basically, well, maybe they're not as pro-Russian as they used to be. But I think they think for a defensive system, which is all, you know, aegis ashore or any of these other anti-missile systems are, it's something they really can't, you know, veto. Because it's not about attacking Russia with these things. You don't really attack. I mean, you can attack with anti-aircraft missiles, which the Russians use a lot of. When they're running short of missiles, they took these old S-300 systems, which were not defending against anything, and they basically used them as bombardment rockets. Now these were, not very effective. They only carried about, 100 kilograms of explosives, but it was all they had, and they did damage. And the damage was mostly done in Ukraine. So the Ukrainians are very enthusiastic about putting all manner of air defense systems inside Ukraine. They'll host anything, and they love to have agents ashore, which I believe the Poles already have in operation. So not only is Russia not going to attack Poland, but if they have all these systems in the Ukraine, they're not going to attack Ukraine either, because the worst thing that can happen to a Russian attack, and the Iranians have learned this, you fire hundreds of missiles at your enemy, in this case it was Israel, and boom, none of them get through. A few get through, but they did very little damage. I think they killed one Palestinian quite by accident when a missile that had been intercepted, the piece of it fell down, and there's video of it actually falling on this poor guy who was just walking along in a Palestinian town, and boom, he was killed. But he was the only fatality, and they can do this again. So with the Russians so bereft of weapons at this point, and for the next 3 or 4 or more years, more defenses in Ukraine means Russia has got less incentive, maybe even to build more offensive rockets, because they say we're just going to provide target practice for these damn Ukrainians. And during the Ukraine war, basically the drone revolution took place, and the Ukrainians were very successful with their drone warfare. In fact, they had longer range, 2,000-kilometer range. They were planning attacks as far north as the Arctic Circle, the Barents Sea, where the Russian Northern Fleet is, the only fleet they have that's worth anything. The Russians were also worried about the Chinese making noises about taking back Vladivostok, which has a Chinese name, which, God, I forget and I couldn't pronounce anyway. But that had long been Chinese territory, and the Russians took it in the 19th century, I believe. And the Chinese want that back. So the Russians are now facing a lot of people they've offended in the past who want a give back program if they want any peace at all. So times are not, good for Russia. And like as I pointed out, the Ukrainians were already on the offensive. They'd taken back about half the terrain that the Russians already held in 2022, and they could keep on going. But they don't want to. As Austin pointed out, both sides have lost a lot of people. There's war fatigue. The Ukrainians welcome peace, but they also welcome the ability to increase their defenses and make it much less likely that the Russians will try and attack again in the near future, the next 5-10 years.
Look, we have a Aegis ashore facility in Romania as well as Poland.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
And but the thing is, Jim, is that if this European Sky Shield comes into being, I think it is going to happen. That would essentially be part of it, tied in through NATO connections.
The Sky Shield.
If Russia attacks Poland, as their defense minister, foreign minister have indicated they're willing to do, there's one member of Putin's government made an outright threat on attacking Poland. Yeah. Well, everybody's going to lose, but Russia's going to lose far more than anyone else. Look, the question that we really are, we've touched on it, but the question is how do you start? What is the term? There's a joint pub, deconfliction. That's it. Yeah, deconfliction. How do you start? In other words, making peace on the battlefield. And this is the way I've described it in other places. Man, don't talk about the devil in the details. They're devils of details. So many of them are actually meaningful. So a term like security architecture, and I know the Department of State likes terms like that, is so anodyne compared to what has got to be solved. What do you do? There are really Ukraine is really heavily industrialized, but Mariupol lost. That's where the Azovstal steel plant was. It held out for so long. And Jim, I believe it was the largest steel plant in the world when it comes to making heavy steel. I recall reading that in 2022. I don't know if that was accurate. That was a huge facility. Now, Kyiv and Kharkiv are manufacturing areas. And then Zaporizhzhia has the nuclear reactors, and it's regarded as another major industrial area for Ukraine. Well, they keep Kyiv and Kharkiv, but they've lost Mariupol and Zaporizhzhia and the Donbass. How does Ukraine compensate for that, or who compensates them? And then, Jim, you touched on this, but we've discussed this before. Putin's attack and taking Crimea in some ways was an oil war, Russian blood, Ukrainian blood for oil, because of the natural gas prospects and some producing that are in the Black Sea. And essentially, if you go by, now Russia takes Crimea back, then suddenly Ukraine loses all those natural gas fields. How are they going to be compensated? Are they going to be compensated? And it's just really a tangle and a nightmare of details, much less getting to the issue of reconstruction. How do you reconstruct all of the infrastructure? What do you do with the infrastructure damage in Ukraine, which is just extensive, bombed out and ruined, and we know who did it, Putin's Russia. And fine, the sanctions come off of Russia. Are they sanctioned by having to give Ukraine unlimited natural gas for the next 50 years? I haven't read that. I'm just tossing that out. Are they going to do that? Is Russia going to agree to that? Who knows?
Well, nobody's going to trust the Russians anymore for anything.
I agree with you.
And the Ukrainians are basically making plans to get their energy needs filled in other ways. If the Ukraine and Poland, by the way, has received most of its 1,000 K2 South Korean tanks.
Yeah.
So they have the largest tank force in Europe. And these are modern tanks, very similar to the M1, actually improved M1, made with all new technology. There's no licensed American technology in those K2s. And Poland has 1,000 of them. And they also have, Leopards and M1s. So they had the largest tank force in Europe, modern tanks. I mean, let's face it, at the end of the war in Russia, they were reduced to pulling T-55s and T-64s out of storage and putting them to work. And they just got blown up right and left. The Ukrainians were very impressed with the Leopard 2. They called it the perfect sniper tank. It had great night sensors, and they would just go out, tank plinking at night. They could spot Russian tanks moving around, and boom, boom, boom. Russians never knew what hit them. So the Russians are basically chastised. You have to look at it from the Russian point of view. They went to war with Ukraine, and they lost. They lost big time. Not just the material they lost all nearly all the modern tanks. They're rebuilding their tank force, and they're doing it with sanctions imposed. The Chinese, for example, were not too happy about this, the war the Russians got themselves into, because they got beaten up. And of course now the Chinese, like I said, are pointing towards the Russian Far East and the cities there, which are actually Chinese cities, and they would like those back. They'd also like back some of the Central Asian area. Not Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan that produces all the oil. They want to safeguard that.
Kazakhstan has significant oil and gas deposits.
Exactly. And the Russians don't want that to fall into the hands of the West, but it already has. The Kazakhstan doesn't want to do business with Russia. I mean, Russia has its own oil, but they wanted to block Kazakhstan from exporting it to anybody Russia didn't like. Well, that's immaterial now, and it will be for at least a few years, maybe 5 or 10 years. And so, like I've said again and again, Ukraine has to rebuild while it can. Now they'll get foreign aid for that, and it's a much easier sell to send foreign aid. I don't know if Trump will go along with this, He said he would stop the war. Well, whoops. I don't know if he'll take credit for what's happened now, this unexpected outbreak of peace, but he's willing to reinforce it. And, giving aid to Ukraine that will not be blown up immediately by the war with Russia is a plus. And they will basically have, the Aegis ashore, all manner of missiles. Those ATACMS missiles, which were shipped over to Ukraine. We only made about 3,500 of those years ago, and we never built any. I don't think they ever revived the production line on the ATACMS. So they are primarily unused. Give them, to Ukraine, and just let them sit there in bunkers and what have you, daring the Russians to try something again. The Russians will try again when they think there's an opportunity. As Austin pointed out, when Biden was around, Russia thought nobody would reinforce the Ukrainians. Well, he was wrong on that angle, because the Europeans basically, grabbed the U.S. by the throat and said, "Look, you got to do it now. This is the war that we've been preparing for during the Cold War, the Russian offensive. Well, it started in Ukraine. We've stopped it. Let's not stop rearming Ukraine. Let's not stop rearming Poland, the other East European NATO members. Here's a chance to basically make ourselves, if not invulnerable, but a very expensive target for Russia to go after." And I think that's going to happen. I mean, this is something, I don't know if Russia took all this into account. Their reason for making peace is exhaustion. They're just out of men, they're out of material, and their economy is a mess. And they basically have people grumbling. I mean, I've seen, I think this will be in a piece in strategy page, later in December. I'm up to December 12th, I think. But they have all these losses that they have to somehow make up for, and they can't do it. They're in a much inferior position to rebuild their arsenal than the West is. And the West has already rebuilt that arsenal to a huge extent. I mean, we got realistic combat training for all the European weapons, IST, and there are a few others. These were now tested in combat. It makes them easier to export. Proven in combat. That's a great selling routine. And now the Europeans have all manner of weapons, which they sent to Ukraine. They performed very well, and the Europeans can now export these things on the favorable terms because they have been combat proven. This is something that cannot be underestimated. All of these weapons are going to pile up, and they'll be sitting there. And if Russia decides to make another attack, they have what they call a calculus of combat, comparative analysis, so to speak. And right now, it's heavily weighted against Russia. You want to keep it that way for as long as you can. Russia will rebuild, but basically they need no more butter than guns right now. Russians are complaining. Like I said, I've got something in strategy page about all the complaints. The Russians are openly denouncing Putin for having squandered Russia's wealth and leaving people hungry and basically bereft of any hope because of his damn war in Ukraine. And you can't underestimate that as a reason for Putin to all of a sudden say, "Okay, we'll stop." You want to make as difficult as possible for Putin to start again, and that only comes by rearming in a big way, and that's already underway. So just don't try and stop it. Try and reinforce it and keep it there. As long as you've got this big stick to hit Russia back with, Russia is going to think twice, 3 or 4 times before they do something again, in the next, 10, maybe 20 years. I mean, Russia will again attack. They've always been attacking Europe. They've been doing that for hundreds of years, well, at least 200 years. And they have to basically be made to believe or to understand. I mean, it's no fantasy. The weapons are there. The Europeans have them, and they're piling them up. And I think that's going to be the biggest deterrent to any future war instigated by Russia. There's just too much for them to go after, especially Ukraine and NATO. Once Ukraine is a NATO member, you don't attack the alliance that basically controls over half the world's GDP. I mean, it's a huge economic behemoth, the NATO alliance. And clause 5 means if you attack one of us, you attack all of us. And that's a pretty intimidating, deterrent that Russia now has to face.
Well, Jim, you're essentially saying there will be another Putin.
Yes.
Well, I agree with you. Let me, Dan, just for a second. I went back and I usually don't scroll the internet during podcasts. I don't. But Jim brought up Siberia and Russia's vulnerability there, and it's real. And this is a March 15th, 2022 column of mine entitled, Meanwhile, in Russia's Backyard Called Siberia. And I'm just going to, there are two short paragraphs. According to Beijing's propagandist, Siberia belongs to China. The current border, approximately 2,740 miles, is an artifact of the 1860 Convention of Peking. The Second Opium War had weakened China. Tsarist Russia was expanding. In 1917, the Bolsheviks acknowledged that Tsarist treaties forced on China were coercive and predatory. Russia, however, has never returned any Siberian territory. And this is the last bit. China hasn't forgotten. In a July 2nd, 2020 tweet, a Chinese state media official scorned Russia's 160th anniversary celebration of the founding of Vladivostok. The official recalled that Vladivostok was a military harbor built on the Chinese city of Haishanhua, which was annexed via the unequal Treaty of Beijing. There you go. That's the back door.
So Russia is up against not only the Western alliance, but China.
Yeah.
China, seeing all this happen, realizes that they bet on the wrong horse, so to speak, in giving they were giving, dual use aid to Russia. Yeah. But now the Russians can't even pay for that. They had to go to North Korea to buy some mercenaries who now have nothing to do. So, suck on that, Russia.
There you go.
All right.
Okay.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Suck on that, Russia.
Next month, we'll do it again. Never get tired of beating on Russia.
Right. Well, we'll see you gentlemen next time.
Okay. Take care, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.